Hey guys, Mr. Hyatt here. This is the continuation of the AP Biology Chapter 45 lecture. We're picking up talking about local regulators, specifically paracrine signaling. Notice that these are non-hormonal chemical signals that we're sending out. They might be growth factors. They might be something like nitric oxide. They might be something called a prostaglandin. So make sure that you are a little bit familiar with each of those and how they work. We've got a little bit more information as we move, but I definitely would make sure I understand what prostaglandins are before the test. Like I mentioned in class, tons of examples of negative and positive feedback in the endocrine system. Like I said, be comfortable with a couple of these. Blood sugar regulation and calcium deposition in bones are really common test examples. Almost every year there are questions on blood sugar. So definitely make sure you're familiar with how we regulate our blood sugar and how feedback works in that process. So remember, a negative feedback loop is going to reduce the original stimulus. A positive feedback loop is going to exacerbate the stimulus. So another way to say that is a negative feedback loop fixes the problem. A positive feedback loop makes the problem worse. In terms of homeostasis, most of our processes involve negative feedback loops. So here's kind of what I'm talking about. You've got low pH in duodenum here as our stimulus. The S cells of the duodenum, that's a specialized kind of skin cell. The duodenum is part of our intestines. They're going to secrete this substance called secretin that's going to target cells in the pancreas that are going to cause bicarbonate to be released. That then raises the pH and fixes the problem. Again, that's negative feedback. So what makes up the endocrine system? Like it says here on the slide, you need to be able to recognize these things. You don't necessarily have to be able to explain them all in detail. So here are all of the glands, and then, of course, organs containing endocrine cells are over here. And again, here are our glands. These are the main ones that we need to, again, recognize. We probably need to be able to talk through this table. I don't expect you to memorize all of this stuff, or even this stuff. But you should probably recognize some of the major factors in each gland. So growth hormone is one that we've talked about in the lecture, so that's probably one to recognize that comes from the anterior pituitary. Prolactin we've also mentioned. Oxytocin we'll mention here in a few. So just make sure that you are familiar with this table. Again, I don't expect you to recognize or explain everything in detail, but it should be somewhat familiar to you before we move into the exam. Last slide that has some of this information. This is posted on Canvas, so you can access it at your leisure. Let's get into blood glucose. So we're talking about blood sugar here. Insulin and glucagon are antagonistic hormones. They're going to be involved in negative feedback. They're going to raise and lower our blood sugar to maintain that homeostasis. In the pancreas, we have these clusters of endocrine cells that are called the islets of Langerhans. They have specific kind of specialized cells called alpha cells that produce glucagon, and then beta cells that produce insulin. So these islets of Langerhans are sort of like if you've ever been in an office building, it's sort of like a set of cubicles. Each set has a specific job. So if you focus on the homeostasis piece, so in the case of sorry, I'm stumbling over my words here. We've got a stimulus here where our blood glucose level rises. So we've gone out trick-or-treating and we're engorging ourselves. So we've processed the sugar. We've got a whole bunch of glucose in our blood. So that stimulus, all that glucose, causes a response in the islets of Langerhans. They're going to make insulin to lower that blood sugar. If we continue that process, insulin's released. The liver's going to take up glucose and store it as glycogen. The body's going to take up glucose. The cells are going to take up glucose. And the blood glucose levels are going to decline. Of course, we're taking blood glucose out because of the insulin. Okay, so if we look at the flip side of that, Now we look at our blood glucose level falling, then the alpha cells in the pancreas are going to release glucagon, which is going to be received by the liver, and it's going to break down glycogen, and is going, break down glycogen, release glucose. It's going to maintain our homeostasis, return our blood sugar levels to where they should be. If we put it all together, we've got our insulin-driven portion here, our glucagon-driven portion here, and we need to maintain this homeostasis here in the middle. So the target tissues for insulin and glucagon, well, how does this work? Insulin reduces blood glucose levels by, we're going to send signals to take up glucose. We're going to stop breaking down glycogen into glucose, and we're going to promote fat storage. We often store energy, we store glucose, we store sugar long term in fat molecules. Then glucagon is going to increase blood glucose levels by stimulating conversion of glycogen back to glucose in the liver and stimulating the breakdown of fats and proteins into glucose, again, so we have more of that energy available for our fight or flight response or for our blood sugar levels. Sorry, I'm mixing up my examples here. So diabetes mellitus is probably the best known endocrine disorder, and that's when folks don't have proper functioning insulin. Type 1, type 2, they're caused by different things. Notice that type 1 is autoimmune, so that presents a whole host of other issues. Research shows that if you have one autoimmune disorder, you're much more prone to develop other autoimmune disorders. So someone that's born with type 1 diabetes has a better chance of developing something like shingles later in life, or something like different types of arthritis that are autoimmune. Type 2, is sometimes called acquired diabetes. Yeah, you sometimes acquire that through poor diet and things like that, and you're looking at a change in your insulin receptors. So either way, insulin's less effective or ineffective. So how do we coordinate all this stuff if it's positive and negative feedback? Or, you've got both types of feedback going, and some things are going to raise the blood glucose, some are going to lower the blood glucose. We need something to control the process. That's going to be called the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus receives the information from the nervous system, translates it, and sends responses through the endocrine system. Notice the pituitary is attached to the hypothalamus. We're going to talk more about the pituitary as we go. But remember, the hypothalamus is the nexus between the nervous system and the endocrine system. We've got the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. Notice the big difference is what they're made from. Posterior pituitary is made of brain tissue. It's going to secrete hormones that are made in the hypothalamus. Anterior makes and releases hormones under the regulation of the hypothalamus, so it's going to make some of these hormones, as opposed to the posterior that doesn't make any. Excuse me. It's just going to store and secrete those. Anterior is going to make them and then release them. And notice it originates from other body tissue, so it's not made of brain tissue. So it's a hybrid gland from two different types of tissue, and that's pretty rare. So if you look where we're talking here, posterior pituitary would be here, anterior would be there. We've got, you can see where it resides in our brain, right next to the hypothalamus, which is adjacent to the thalamus. So yeah, you can see kind of where it is. Pineal gland is going to be big here in a little bit as well. So the posterior pituitary hormones act directly on non-endocrine tissues. So you can see that kind of here. Here are two of the cells. Two of the hormones that I'm talking about: ADH and oxytocin. Oxytocin I talked a little bit about in class one day. That's the hormone that's responsible for the puppy love feeling, that crush feeling that you get in the springtime sometimes. It also induces uterine contractions and the release of milk. Many women are given oxytocin or a derivative of oxytocin to induce labor. My wife was given oxytocin with both of our children, and they definitely jump-started her contractions and got the whole process moving and got our kids out. That same hormone also stimulates the production and the release of milk. So when baby suckles, that sends a message that's the stimulus that gets received by the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is going to release oxytocin from the posterior pituitary, and that's going to further stimulate the milk gland. So that's an example of positive feedback. We got the blood glucose levels. That's an example of negative feedback, and here's an example of positive feedback. ADH is the other molecule that was mentioned in that last picture, and it's going to enhance water reabsorption in the kidneys. It's anti-diuretic. Anything that's diuretic is going to affect the kidneys. Picture of the milk release positive feedback. Notice here we've got, between our response and our stimulus, we've got a green plus arrow. In negative feedback, we had a red minus arrow. So remember, positive feedback, milk is going to cause suckling, which is going to cause this to happen, which is going to continuously exacerbate the stimulus. The anterior pituitary is going to be controlled by releasing and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. So, excuse me. So, best example, or best way to understand this is kind of talk from the examples. We've got TRH and TSH that are secreted from the anterior pituitary. So yeah, let me just... Here are several of the hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary. Again, we're receiving messages from the hypothalamus. We're creating chemicals, and then we're excreting them. So, again, several of these are listed here. Prolactin is one that I mentioned earlier. I think that's the only one of these that I have mentioned. So, tropic hormones. Notice, let me go back a slide. Notice here we've got tropic effects, non-tropic effects. There was metabotropic term on our last test that I got rid of. But excuse me. Tropic hormones are going to regulate the function of cells or glands, endocrine cells or glands. So they're hormones that control the hormone system, if that makes sense. TSH, FSH, luteinizing hormone, ACTH, those are all examples of hormones that act upon the endocrine system. So they're really heavily involved in regulating. Regulating the regulation process, if that makes sense. Non-tropic hormones are going to be ones that target non-endocrine tissues. They're going to be produced by the anterior pituitary. Again, there are those two listed. Prolactin stimulates lactation for sure. Has diverse effects in different vertebrates. It's conserved across kingdoms is what I'm trying to get at. Most vertebrates anyway, have prolactin. It just does something different in a lot of them, a lot of different ones. Growth hormones are secreted by the anterior pituitary. It has tropic and non-tropic actions. That should make sense. Think about what happens when you go through puberty. Everything changes, especially hormone levels. Promotes growth and has a diverse metabolic effects. Your metabolism goes crazy as you go through puberty. An excess of that growth hormone can cause gigantism, while a lack of growth hormone can cause dwarfism. So that you should see how that kind of fits in with homeostasis and all that kind of stuff. Kind of a Goldilocks idea. I will pick up with the thyroid hormone in the next portion of the flip.